I'm Sabrina Hayes, 46 female. For nearly 2 decades, my life has been built within the steel and glass walls of Vance Solutions, a company I helped raise from a scrappy startup into a tech powerhouse. As Chief Operating Officer, I was the architect of its internal workings, the one who made sure the trains not only ran on time, but also laid their own track into the future. My world was one of budgets, logistics, and the quiet satisfaction of a well-executed plan. But this story isn't about building a company. It's about what happens when the founder's son decides your legacy is just a stepping stone on his path to the throne. It's about being pushed into a basement, only to find the keys to the kingdom hidden there all along. Before this story unfolds, I'd love to connect with you. Please let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is in your corner of the world. It's amazing to see how far these stories can travel. The air in the 18th floor conference room always had a specific quality: thin, chilled, and smelling faintly of ozone and expensive coffee. It was an atmosphere I'd cultivated over years, one designed for clarity and decisive action. But that morning, it felt different. It felt curdled. The change agent was Preston Vance, a man who wore his father's legacy like a rented tuxedo, ill-fitting and stained with arrogance. He strode in with the unearned confidence of someone who had never faced a real consequence in his life. His hair was a sculpted marvel of high-end product, his tie artfully loosened to project an image of a maverick, a disruptor. He was the company's new Director of Innovation, a title as hollow as the platitudes he was about to deliver. He cleared his throat, a sound that grated against the room's professional silence. He was trying to channel the gravitas of a tech visionary, but all I could see was a child playing dress-up in his father's office. He was holding a laminated memo from HR, and the way he brandished it felt less like a corporate announcement and more like an executioner's warrant. I watched him, my face a mask of neutral composure. For 18 years, I had been the steady hand on the tiller of this company. I'd navigated us through market downturns, hostile acquisition attempts, and the time our entire server farm was threatened by a freak plumbing disaster. I'd mentored most of the people in this room, fought for their raises, and defended their projects. They were my team. This was my work. Preston smiled, a slick, predatory thing that never reached his eyes. "Effective immediately," he announced, his voice booming with forced authority. "Sabrina will be transitioning into a more specialized strategic role. She'll be our new basement operations liaison." A profound, vacuum-sealed silence descended upon the room. It was the kind of quiet that follows a sudden, shocking event, where everyone's brain is struggling to process what just happened. I saw Gerald, one of our senior board members, blink twice, a slow, deliberate motion as if trying to clear an unbelievable image from his vision. Another director, a woman I'd known for a decade, picked up her pen and then set it down, her hand hovering over her notepad as if she couldn't bring herself to document such a monumental act of foolishness. The potted ficus in the corner seemed to wilt under the weight of the collective disbelief. A basement operations liaison? It was a title so absurdly insulting it was almost comical. It was corporate speak for being banished to the archives, to the place where old equipment and forgotten careers went to die. He might as well have asked me to start cleaning the bathrooms. I looked at Preston, then at the faces of my team. I saw confusion, fear, and a flicker of pity in their eyes. They knew what this was. It was a public humiliation, a power play designed to erase my influence and clear the path for his own ascent. He wanted a reaction. He wanted tears, anger, a dramatic outburst that would justify his decision and paint me as unstable. I gave him nothing. Instead, I offered a smile, thin and sharp as a razor's edge. "Perfect," I said, my voice calm and even. The single word hung in the air, cutting through the tension. Preston's smirk faltered for a fraction of a second, his plan for a dramatic confrontation deflated by my placid acceptance. As he turned to a ridiculously titled PowerPoint slide, Sabrina's next chapter, a ground floor opportunity, I stood up with deliberate grace. I smoothed the front of my blazer and in one fluid motion slid a slim, unassuming blue folder from beneath my laptop and tucked it into my handbag. The movement was so casual, so seamless, that almost no one noticed. The only exception was Sarah from our legal department. Her eyes, sharp and perceptive, narrowed for a moment. Her eyebrow twitched, a tiny, almost imperceptible signal that she sensed a tremor in the corporate force. She knew me well enough to understand that my silence was never a sign of surrender. That blue folder was my insurance policy. It contained a clause buried so deep within our investor agreements that only a handful of people knew it existed. It was a relic from a time of corporate crisis, a safeguard I had personally helped draft and get notarized 2 years prior, back when the board valued institutional knowledge over inherited names. Preston launched into his presentation, spewing buzzwords about synergy and embracing new operational paradigms. He was effectively reading my corporate eulogy, describing my banishment as a strategic move to get me more in touch with the company's foundational infrastructure. It was a masterpiece of corporate doublespeak. The rest of the meeting passed in a haze of strained applause and averted gazes. People shuffled out, whispering amongst themselves, carefully avoiding my eye. An HR representative handed me a document outlining my new duties, which seemed to primarily involve inventorying obsolete hardware. I took it without a word. I walked out of that gleaming conference room with my head held high. My handbag felt a little heavier, my resolve a little harder. Preston thought he had won. He believed he had successfully neutralized the biggest obstacle to his takeover. What he failed to understand was that he hadn't just demoted me, he had armed me. By exiling me to the basement, he had just handed me the time, the space, and the perfect motive to dismantle his entire glass kingdom, piece by painful piece. This wasn't a demotion. It was the beginning of a slow, calculated checkmate. The official exile began not with a formal meeting or a respectful transition plan, but with a cold, impersonal calendar update that appeared on my screen at 7:45 the next morning. New workspace assignment, B-level Operations Hub, it read. Operations Hub was a laughable euphemism for the cavernous, windowless basement level where we stored broken office chairs and the ghosts of failed projects. There was no personal note, no explanation, just a digital shove into the abyss. A few minutes later, my keycard was denied at the executive floor turnstile. The light flashed red, a silent, definitive rejection. By 8:00 a.m., my inbox, usually a relentless torrent of board-level communications, vendor negotiations, and urgent budget approvals, had fallen eerily silent. It was as if a switch had been flipped, cutting me off from the central nervous system of the company I had helped build. At 8:15, a nervous young intern named Ben, whose main qualification seemed to be his inability to make eye contact, knocked on my office door. He was clutching a clipboard and a floor plan of the building as if they were a shield and sword. "Ms. Hayes," he stammered. "Mr. Vance asked me to, escort you to your new workstation. He thought you might not know the way." I offered him a smile I reserved for particularly naive salespeople and incompetent ex-boyfriends, a smile that was all teeth. "Thank you, Ben, but I think I can find it. I helped draft the original blueprints for this building," I said, my tone light but edged with steel. The poor kid turned a shade of crimson usually reserved for bad sunburns. He was just a pawn in Preston's pathetic game of corporate chess. I waved him away gently, not wanting to transfer my anger onto him. I packed my personal effects into a small box, a framed photo, a couple of books, a succulent that had somehow survived years of my neglect. I grabbed my laptop bag, which contained the all-important blue folder. I took one last look at the office that had been my command center for nearly 2 decades. It wasn't the view or the expensive furniture I'd miss. It was the flow of information, the hum of productivity, the feeling of being at the heart of it all. But that was gone, at least for now. I decided to take the stairs. Descending into the basement felt symbolic. Level B1 was a graveyard of corporate history. Obsolete servers lined one wall like metallic coffins. Stacks of file cabinets were plastered with faded labels. Q2 2009 expense reports. Project Phoenix defunct, do not shred. The air was thick with the smell of dust, old paper, and the faint, chemical scent of industrial cleaner. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed with a weary, flickering indecision, casting long, distorted shadows across the concrete floor. My new office was a metal folding table positioned next to a slop sink. It came with a single, wobbly chair and, most notably, a complete absence of power outlets. The ambient aroma was a unique blend of lemon-scented bleach and a deep, foundational mildew. This, apparently, was the smell of my new, focused strategic role. I sat down, the cold of the metal chair seeping through my clothes. I opened my laptop, its battery life now a precious and finite resource. The company Wi-Fi, of course, was too weak to reach this forgotten corner of the building. Preston had clearl. Why thought of everything? Or so he believed. I tethered my laptop to my phone's hotspot and got to work. My first priority wasn't plotting revenge, it was tying up loose ends. There were several high-value vendor contracts I had been negotiating, deals that Preston, in his infinite ignorance, had likely forgotten about. These were agreements critical to our supply chain, and letting them fall through the cracks would be a quiet act of sabotage I wasn't willing to commit. The company's well-being still mattered to me, even if its new leadership didn't. I spent the next 2 hours firing off emails, securing digital signatures, and finalizing the terms. I meticulously timestamped every communication and uploaded copies of the signed agreements to my personal, encrypted cloud storage. I even took screen recordings of our internal project management dashboard, which, by some administrative oversight, still granted me COO-level access. I knew that window would close soon. At precisely 11:02 a.m., it did. An automated email from the IT department landed in my inbox. The subject line was blunt: Executive Permissions Update. The body was even more so: Sabrina Hayes has been reassigned to the non-executive tier. Access Group, Operational Support Level 3, effective immediately. I stared at the email, a cold sense of certainty washing over me. This was it. This was the official, documented act of demotion, the digital paper trail. Preston, in his haste to consolidate his power, had just handed me the loaded weapon I needed. He didn't know it, but that simple, bureaucratic email was the key that unlocked the most powerful and forgotten clause in our company's history. The language was perfect. Material reassignment. Revocation of executive authority. These were the exact trigger phrases I had helped write 2 years ago. This wasn't just an insult, it was a contractual breach of our investor agreement. I immediately forwarded the IT email to Isabel Morrow, the head of our primary investment firm. I added no commentary, no emotional plea. The email itself was the message. A few moments later, my phone buzzed with her reply. It was a single emoji, a thumbs up. It was concise, professional, and utterly lethal. Upstairs, I could almost hear Preston patting himself on the back. He was probably bragging to the HR manager about his decisive leadership, perhaps even spitballing ideas for branded polo shirts for his new, streamlined executive team. He was walking around his new kingdom, oblivious to the fact that the ground beneath his feet was about to give way. Down in my basement exile, I continued my work in silence. I didn't make angry phone calls or fire off scathing emails. I simply let the storm gather. With every document I archived and every log file I saved, I was building my case. I ate a sandwich I'd packed from home, the silence of the basement punctuated only by the distant hum of the building's HVAC system. And I smiled. Because sometimes, the most effective strategy is to let your enemy believe they've already won. You let them build their castle on a foundation of sand, and you wait patiently for the tide to come in. My descent into the basement wasn't a surprise. It was the predictable, albeit clumsy, conclusion to a plot I had uncovered 2 months earlier. The moment of revelation hadn't occurred in a boardroom or during a tense negotiation. It happened in the sterile quiet of the third-floor break room, next to a coffee machine that always sounded like it was on the verge of a mechanical breakdown. I was waiting for it to dispense what I affectionately called my mid-morning cup of hazelnut-flavored despair when I heard Preston's voice drifting from the adjacent hallway. He wasn't trying to be discreet. Preston's volume was perpetually set to look at me, a booming, self-important tenor that commanded attention for all the wrong reasons. He was talking to a junior analyst, one of the sycophantic young men who orbited him like pilot fish around a shark. "She's a relic," Preston said, the words dripping with condescending dismissal. He was talking about me. "She's been holding this place back for years with her processes and protocols. Once she's out of the picture, I'll restructure the cap table and consolidate my control before the end of the fiscal year. Dad's already on board. All I have to do is push her down a few floors, and the equity shift automatically unlocks." There was a brief pause, followed by the nervous, high-pitched laughter of the junior analyst. Then Preston joined in, a braying, triumphant sound that echoed down the empty corridor. It was the laugh of a man who believed he had outsmarted everyone in the room. My blood didn't boil. It turned to ice. It wasn't the insult that struck me, it was the sheer, arrogant stupidity of his plan. He was discussing a corporate coup, a move with massive financial and legal implications, in a public hallway. It confirmed everything I already suspected about him. He was reckless, overconfident, and profoundly ignorant of the complex machinery that kept the company running. That was the fundamental difference between us. Preston saw power as a birthright, something to be seized and displayed. I had learned over 18 years that real control was quiet, precise, and often invisible. It was exercised not through loud declarations, but through meticulous planning and a deep understanding of the rules of the game. It was the difference between a sledgehammer and a scalpel. I abandoned my half-brewed coffee and walked back to my office, my mind already racing. His words, "push her down a few floors," were the key. He wasn't planning to fire me, which would trigger a hefty severance package and immediate scrutiny from the board. He was planning a demotion, a public humiliation designed to make me quit. It was a classic corporate power play, but he was executing it with the finesse of a charging bull. I went straight to my digital vault, a heavily encrypted Dropbox folder that not even our IT department knew existed. It was my personal archive, a repository of every significant document I had ever touched during my tenure. It held drafts of contracts, minutes from forgotten investor meetings, and notes on verbal agreements that had shaped the company's trajectory. And there, in a subfolder labeled Crosswell Ventures Agreement 2023 Restructuring, was the document I was looking for. Glowing on my screen like a holy grail was Section 12, subsection C, Key Persons/Change of Control Clause. I remembered it vividly. 2 years ago, the company had faced a minor liquidity crisis. Panic was rippling through the executive team. While everyone else was scrambling to secure a bridge loan and calm anxious shareholders, I was working late with our then legal counsel, a brilliant, old-school lawyer who remembered a time before email. We were restructuring the investment agreement with our primary backers, Orion Capital, a firm run by the formidable Isabel Morrow. Amidst the chaos, I had tucked a small, powerful safeguard into the fine print. The clause was my brainchild, born from a growing concern over the founder's declining health and his son's undisguised ambition. It stated that in the event any of the listed key persons were to be materially reassigned, demoted, or otherwise stripped of executive authority without a supermajority vote from the board of directors, operational control of the company would temporarily revert to Orion Capital for a stabilization period of no less than 18 months. And guess who was listed as the first key person, right after the CEO himself? That's right. Me. Getting that clause approved had been a masterclass in subtlety. It took several rounds of revisions, a few strategically passive-aggressive emails, and one very expensive dinner with the legal team to shepherd it through the approval process without raising any red flags. It was framed as a standard investor protection measure, and in the panic of the moment, everyone signed off on it, including Arthur Vance, the founder and CEO. They were too focused on the immediate fire to notice the sprinkler system I was installing. Now, after overhearing Preston's little monologue, I knew he was about to wander blindly into my carefully laid trap. This wasn't just a possibility anymore, it was an inevitability. His ego wouldn't let him see the danger. My quiet, calculated response to his public demotion wasn't weakness. It was the final, patient step in a plan that had been set in motion by a single, careless whisper in a hallway. He thought he was the hunter, but he had been the prey all along. Armed with the knowledge of Preston's intentions, I shifted from passive observation to active preparation. This wasn't about revenge, not yet. It was about survival and the preservation of the company I had dedicated my life to. My first step was a deep, systematic review of every document related to corporate governance. I spent my evenings and weekends poring over investor agreements, board bylaws, and my own employment contract, dissecting each sentence and cross-referencing every clause. I became an archaeologist of our own corporate history, digging for buried leverage. I needed to be absolutely certain that the key person clause was airtight, that there were no loopholes, no subsequent amendments that could invalidate it. I meticulously traced the chain of custody for every signature, confirming which board members were present for the vote, who had initialed which addendums, and which versions of the document were considered the legal final. The work was tedious but essential. I created a digital fortress, saving time-stamped PDF copies of every relevant document to 2 separate encrypted flash drives. For good measure, I printed a physical copy of the entire Orion Capital agreement, had it notarized by an outside firm, and placed it in a safe deposit box at a bank across town. The box was registered under the name of my sister's dog, a scrappy little terrier named General Patton. It felt fitting. My quiet investigation was a solitary affair. I couldn't risk confiding in anyone at the office, not even those I trusted. Preston's influence, backed by his father's name, was pervasive. Whispers traveled fast in the corporate world, and I needed my actions to remain invisible until the moment of impact. My final preparatory step was the most critical. I scheduled a catch-up coffee with Isabel Morrow herself. Isabel was the managing partner at Orion Capital, a titan in the world of private equity. She was sharp, unsentimental, and possessed an almost supernatural ability to detect corporate nonsense. We had worked closely during the 2023 restructuring, and I knew she valued competence and stability above all else. She would not be pleased to learn that the company she had invested hundreds of millions of dollars in was about to be turned into a playground for an unqualified heir. She arrived at the small, discreet cafe I'd chosen exactly on time, without an assistant or any of the usual trappings of power. She was dressed in a simple but impeccably tailored suit, and she ordered a black Americano with an air of someone who doesn't have time for frivolity. "I was wondering when you might call, Sabrina," she said as she sat down, her gaze direct and assessing. There was no preamble, no small talk. Isabel dealt in a world of high stakes, and she knew this wasn't a social call. How close is he to doing something stupid? I didn't have to explain who he was. "Closer than he realizes," I replied, taking a sip of my own tea. "He's been making noise about restructuring, consolidating his control." She nodded slowly, her expression unreadable. "Let me know the moment he puts something in writing." It wasn't a question, it was an instruction. "You'll be the first person I call," I assured her. Isabel was no fool. Orion Capital hadn't built its empire by allowing trust fund princelings to incinerate their portfolio companies. She understood the immense power that Section 12, subsection C, gave her. More importantly, she understood the critical importance of timing. For the clause to be effective, Preston had to be the one to make the move. I couldn't be seen as instigating the conflict. He had to pull the trigger himself. "Let him play his little game of chess," she said with a faint, mirthless smile. "We'll just be waiting to set the board on fire." That meeting solidified my resolve. I now had a powerful, silent ally waiting in the wings. For the next several weeks, I went about my job with a quiet, unwavering focus. I watched as Preston continued his campaign of self-aggrandizement. He called himself the company's acting visionary in meetings and proposed a series of ill-conceived, buzzword-laden initiatives, including a disastrous foray into the world of NFTs that he barely understood. I didn't challenge him. I didn't warn him. I didn't give him any indication that I knew what he was planning. Instead, I documented everything. Every time he excluded me from a critical email chain, I saved a copy. Every time he made a dismissive comment about my role in a meeting, I logged the date and time. Every attempt he made to undermine my authority was another piece of evidence, another nail for the coffin he was unknowingly building for himself. The corporate world is a battlefield, but the most powerful weapons are not always the loudest. Sometimes, the most devastating weapon is a forgotten clause in a dusty contract. My weapon was loaded, notarized, and ready. And Preston Vance, in his blind ambition, was walking directly into its line of fire. I just had to wait for him to take the final, fatal step. The morning I called Isabel Morrow, the sky outside my new basement office, if one could call it that, was a monotonous, oppressive gray. It felt appropriate. I sat with my hand over my phone for a moment longer than necessary. It wasn't doubt that made me hesitate, it was the gravity of the step I was about to take. This was the point of no return. Once I officially brought Isabel and Orion Capital into the fray, this would cease to be an internal corporate dispute. It would become a full-blown financial and legal war, the kind that leaves careers shattered and legacies in ruins. I dialed the direct line she had given me 2 years ago, a number reserved for emergencies and high-level strategy. She answered on the second ring, her voice as crisp and clear as ever. "Sabrina," she said. It wasn't a question, she already knew. "Do you have a moment to discuss a certain clause in our agreement?" I asked, keeping my voice steady and professional. "I only have time for the interesting ones," she replied, and I could hear the faint clink of ice against glass in the background. With Isabel, that could mean she was in her corner office or on the deck of her yacht, Bot. H were equally plausible on a Tuesday morning. I laid out the situation without drama or embellishment. I gave her the facts: Preston's public demotion, the revocation of my executive permissions, the official IT email that documented the change. I told her the board was passive, either intimidated by the Vance name or simply asleep at the wheel. "I've reviewed the contract again this morning," I concluded. "The clause is still valid." "Section 12, subsection C," she stated, not asking. She had a mind like a steel trap. "That's the one. The definition of a key person explicitly includes the chief operating officer. The language requires a supermajority board vote for any material reassignment, which this certainly qualifies as." "I remember," Isabel said, a hint of amusement in her voice. "We called it the 'in case of nepotism' clause during the drafting stages. Prophetic, wasn't it?" "You could say that," I said dryly. "And unless I'm mistaken, your investment agreement still grants Orion Capital temporary operational control in the event of a change of control triggered by such an event." There was a brief pause on the line. "Send me the most recent version you have, along with the IT notification," she instructed. "I want to see the official letterhead and timestamps." I had it ready. The PDF was notarized, with page numbers and digital signatures burned into the document. I attached the IT email and hit send. I could hear the soft clicking of her keyboard as she opened the files. A few moments of silence passed. "This is the original signature set," she confirmed. "Your timestamp on the demotion notice matches our records. You've been very patient, Sabrina." "I wanted to ensure he was the one pulling the trigger," I explained. "I'm not initiating a fight, I'm responding to one." She let out a short, appreciative laugh. "You always had more strategic sense than the rest of them combined. You should have taken the CEO job 3 years ago when Arthur first offered it." "I didn't want the title," I said honestly. "I wanted the ability to protect the company from being run into the ground by someone who thinks a balance sheet is a type of yoga." "Well," Isabel said, her tone shifting from conversational to decisive, "it appears your insurance policy is about to pay out. I won't make a move until he signs the official HR paperwork formalizing your new role. But the moment he does, you call me. We'll make this fast and clean." We ended the call. I leaned back in my wobbly plastic chair, the reality of the situation settling in. It wasn't a feeling of triumph, not yet. It was the cold, quiet click of a tumbler falling into place in a complex lock. The final piece of the mechanism was about to be activated. The official HR forms for my reassignment were a formality, but a necessary one. They were the physical proof, the wet ink signature that would make the entire process legally indisputable. For the rest of the day, I stayed in my basement bunker. I meticulously documented my limited access, taking screenshots of internal systems that now barred me. I answered the few low-level emails that trickled down to my new, forgotten corner of the company. I was a ghost in the machine, and that was exactly what I needed to be. Meanwhile, upstairs, Preston was parading his victory. I heard through the grapevine that he'd held a meeting with his inner circle, celebrating the successful restructuring and his new, uncontested authority. He was so blinded by his own ego that he couldn't see the ground crumbling beneath him. At 4:30 p.m., an email from HR arrived. It was a request to electronically sign the document confirming my acceptance of the basement operations liaison position. I ignored it. I needed his physical signature on the master document first. Let him make the final, irrevocable move. The countdown had begun, and the bomb was in his hands. He just didn't know it yet. The next morning's leadership meeting was scheduled for 9:00 a.m. It was intended to be Preston's coronation, the formal unveiling of his new organizational chart. He walked into the room 15 minutes late, holding a ludicrously green protein shake and wearing a grin that said he believed he was about to receive a standing ovation. Most of the department heads were already there, nursing their coffees and trying to look busy on their phones. The tension in the room was palpable. I was seated at the far end of the long conference table, a deliberate choice. I had no nameplate, no laptop, no presentation materials. I was an observer, a ghost at the feast. All I had was my handbag with the blue folder inside and my phone placed face down on the polished wood surface. Preston clapped his hands together, a loud, jarring sound. "All right, team," he boomed, as if kicking off a pep rally. "Big day today. We're finalizing the new vision for Vance Solutions." Someone coughed. The CFO stared intently into his empty coffee cup. Preston, oblivious, moved to the head of the table. "And to kick things off," he said, his eyes finally landing on me, "we're formally confirming Sabrina's new role. HR has the paperwork ready, just needs my final signature to make it all official." He winked at the director of sales, who looked down at his notes as if they contained the secrets of the universe. An HR manager, looking deeply uncomfortable, stepped forward with a clipboard holding a thick document. Preston took it, gave it a cursory glance, and picked up the expensive fountain pen he always carried. "Let's do this," he said with a flourish. He signed the first page, then the second, his signature a flamboyant, arrogant scrawl. With each stroke of the pen, he was sealing his own fate, meticulously documenting the very act that would trigger his downfall. I watched, my expression unreadable, my heart beating a slow, steady rhythm. I waited until the pen was capped, until the HR manager had collected the signed document and retreated to the side of the room. Then, and only then, did I move. I stood up slowly. "Thank you, Preston," I said, my voice clear and carrying across the silent room. He blinked, clearly thrown off by my lack of protest. "You're welcome," he stammered, a flicker of confusion crossing his face. I ignored him and turned my attention to the assembled directors. I picked up my phone, turned it over, and with a single tap, activated the speakerphone. The sound of a dial tone filled the room, each ring echoing like a tick of a clock counting down to 0. After the third ring, a crisp, professional voice answered. "Orion Capital, Isabel Morrow speaking." I kept my eyes on the board members, not on Preston. "Isabel, it's Sabrina," I said calmly. Her tone sharpened instantly. "Is it done?" "It's official," I confirmed. The triggering event was signed and witnessed at 9:17 a.m. Eastern Time. There was a beat of silence on the other end. Then Isabel's voice, cool and decisive, came through the speaker. "Understood. My team is moving. Stand by." I ended the call and placed the phone back on the table. The atmosphere in the room had shifted. The air grew heavy, charged with a sudden, unspoken understanding that something monumental had just occurred. "What in the world was that?" Preston sputtered, attempting a laugh that died in his throat. I leaned back in my chair, folding my hands on the table. "You just triggered a change of control clause in our primary investor agreement," I said, my voice dangerously soft. Specifically, Section 12, subsection C. I'm sure you're familiar with it. Preston's brow furrowed. What? What clause? Across the table, several directors were already frantically tapping on their tablets, their faces paling as they pulled up the document. It's the clause, I continued, my gaze locking onto his, that grants our primary investor, Orion Capital, temporary operational control of this company if a key executive is materially reassigned without a supermajority board vote, which you just did, on paper, with witnesses. Somewhere in the room, a ceramic mug slipped from someone's grasp and shattered on the floor. No one moved to clean it up. But the board didn't object. Preston stammered, his bravado crumbling. No one said a word. Silence is not consent, Preston, I said, standing up. It's fear. And now, I gestured to the signed papers on the HR manager's clipboard, you've just provided the legal documentation for your own removal from power. His face drained of all color, leaving him looking pale and suddenly very young. His mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. He looked like a fish that had just been pulled from the water, gasping for air in a world it didn't understand. I'm calling legal, he finally managed, fumbling for his phone. Good idea, I said, walking towards the door. But I'd be quick about it. Isabel's team is already drafting the transfer of control documents. And by the time they're filed, I paused at the threshold, turning back to face him, it won't be your company's legal team you're calling. The only sound as I walked away was the sharp, rhythmic click of my heels on the marble floor. No one spoke. No one followed. The king was dead. He just didn't know it yet. The emergency board meeting was convened for 4:30 p.m., but the atmosphere of crisis had already permeated the entire executive floor. The conference room was filled with a low hum of anxiety. People avoided eye contact, fiddling with their pens and staring at blank notepads. Preston was already there, pacing near the window like a caged animal. He had spent the afternoon in a flurry of panicked calls, only to discover that every door he pushed against was now locked. Legal had confirmed the clause was valid. The board members, suddenly remembering their fiduciary duties, had distanced themselves. His father, Arthur, was unreachable. Preston stormed in, his face flushed with a mixture of rage and disbelief. This is absurd, he declared to the room at large. That clause is a 2-year-old relic from a financial crisis that no longer exists. It was never meant to be a live grenade. Our general counsel, a man who had weathered dozens of corporate storms with quiet stoicism, slid a folder across the table toward Preston. He tapped a single spot on the top page. There, next to the very clause Preston was trying to dismiss, were the unmistakable initials of his own father. AV. The silence in the room was deafening. Preston stared at the initials, his argument collapsing before it had even begun. That could have been added later, he stammered weakly. The general counsel then produced a second document. A time-stamped digital signature verification from DocuSign, complete with the corresponding email chain showing approval from legal, finance, and the CEO's office. All dated, all irrefutable. Just as Preston's last defense crumbled, the conference phone in the center of the table chirped to life. The caller ID read, Arthur Vance. A moment later, the old man's voice, strained but firm, filled the room. Is my son there? He asked. Yes, Mr. Vance, the general counsel replied. And Sabrina? I'm here, Arthur, I said quietly. Good, he said. Effective immediately, Preston is to step back from all operational duties. Isabel Morrow and Orion Capital will assume control as per the agreement. This board will cooperate fully. Dad, you can't, Preston yelled, his voice cracking. I can, Arthur's voice boomed back, cold and final. And I am. You acted recklessly, you triggered a catastrophic clause you didn't bother to understand, and you have jeopardized this entire company. This is the consequence. The line went dead. No one moved. I stood, gathered my things, and looked directly at Preston. There was no triumph in my eyes, no smirk. Just the quiet, heavy finality of a battle won. I walked out of the room, leaving him to drown in the silence. The next morning, Isabel Morrow arrived. She didn't walk into the lobby. She materialized, a force of nature in a black pantsuit and carrying a leather briefcase that looked like it could withstand a direct impact. She bypassed reception and took the elevator straight to the 18th floor, where the board was already gathered in a state of shell shock. She entered the conference room without knocking. The space was hers now, after all. "Gentlemen," she said, her voice cutting through the tension. "And Sabrina." She placed her briefcase on the table with a soft, authoritative click. "This," she said, pulling out a single, signed document, "is the legal notice confirming the transfer of operational authority to Orion Capital. And this," she produced a second paper, "is the board notification invalidating Preston Vance's executive appointment due to gross mismanagement and violation of investor protocols." She turned her gaze to Preston, who stood frozen by the door. "Effective immediately, you are removed from your position. Your access to all company systems will be terminated by noon." Then she looked at me. "Sabrina," she said, her voice now calm and clear, "as per the stabilization terms of the clause, we need an interim CEO, someone who knows this company inside and out. I am appointing you to that role with the full backing of Orion Capital's controlling interest." A quiet murmur of assent went around the table. No one objected. I gave a single, firm nod. "I accept." Isabel gestured to the head of the table, the chair Preston had so briefly and foolishly occupied. I walked over and sat down. The leather felt familiar, like coming home. I looked at Preston, now just a man in a room where he no longer had any power. He was an irrelevance. The first document on the table in front of me was the formal paperwork for my appointment as interim CEO. The second was a printed copy of an email retrieved by Isabel's legal team during their initial review. It was from Preston to his junior analyst, sent the day after my demotion. It read, "Phase 1 complete, she's in the basement. Now we just starve her out, she'll quit within a month." I picked up my pen, signed the appointment letter, and leaned back in the chair. It was a perfect, beautiful irony. The man who had tried to erase me from the company had instead handed me the pen to sign myself into its highest office. I looked up at the board, then at Isabel, and finally my gaze drifted to the doorway where Preston still stood, utterly defeated. I didn't need to say a word. My presence in that chair said everything. "Meeting adjourned," I announced. As the directors filed out, I met Preston's gaze one last time. A small, knowing smile touched my lips. "Welcome to the basement, Preston," I said softly. "I hear it's character building."